There is a family whose name is still on hospitals, still on libraries, still carved into the stone of buildings that have stood for 600 years. They did not conquer land. They did not lead armies. They lent money. And somehow, that made them the most powerful family in the world. At their peak, they influenced the finances of kings, popes, and entire nations. And they did it starting from a single room in a city the size of a small town. That should not be possible. This is the story of how it happened and why nothing quite like it has ever happened again. The city is Florence, Italy. The year is around 1397. Florence is not a kingdom. It has no king. It is a republic, a city that governs itself. It has about 60,000 people, roughly the size of a modern mid-sized town. And into this city, a man named Giovanni de Medici opens a bank. Not a grand institution, not a palace of finance. A small operation, a desk, ledgers, a small staff. Within 100 years, that desk would become the financial backbone of the entire continent of Europe. The question is not just how they did it. The question is why no one else could stop them. The world they entered. To understand what the Medici built, you first need to understand what the world looked like before them. Medieval Europe had a money problem. Not a shortage of money, a movement problem. Imagine you are a merchant in Venice. You want to buy silk from a trader in London. You cannot wire money. There are no banks in the modern sense. There are no credit cards. The only way to pay someone far away is to physically carry gold or silver across hundreds of miles of dangerous roads, through bandits, through wars, through mountain passes that killed men in winter. Merchants lost fortunes, literally, on the road. Commerce, the trading of goods between cities and countries, was limited by this single brutal fact. Money could not travel safely. And then someone invented a piece of paper that changed everything. It was called a letter of credit, but the Medici called their version something else. They called it a lettera di cambio, a bill of exchange. Here is how it worked. You walk into the Medici Bank in Florence. You hand them 100 gold coins. They give you a letter, just a piece of paper with writing on it. You travel to London. You walk into the Medici branch in London. You hand them the letter. They give you the equivalent value in English pounds. No gold crossed the Alps. No bandits were involved. No one was robbed. The money, in a sense, teleported. This was not a new idea. Other banks had tried versions of it, but the Medici perfected it, and more importantly, they built the network that made it trustworthy. Because a letter of credit is only valuable if people believe it will be honored. And that is where the Medici were different from everyone else. The network. Giovanni de Medici had a simple but radical insight. A bank in one city is useful. A bank in every major city in Europe is unstoppable. He began opening branches, not franchises, not partnerships with strangers. Branches, controlled, staffed, and run by people he personally vetted, often from families he knew. Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London, Avignon, Barcelona. Each branch operated semi-independently. Each had its own manager called a factor. Each kept its own books. Each was responsible for its own profits and losses. But here is the genius of the structure. They were all connected. If a merchant in Bruges needed to pay a supplier in Venice, the Medici network made it seamless. The letter traveled. The branches honored each other's obligations. Trust moved across borders because the Medici name was behind all of it. In 1494, French troops marched into Florence. Credit tightened. Trade slowed. Merchants who had never set foot in Florence felt the absence of a network they had never seen. That is how embedded it had become. The emotional register lifts. Wonder. Reflection. Here is what is strange. The Medici lost their bank. They lost their power. They were exiled twice. And yet, two members of the Medici family became queens of France. Catherine de Medici, Marie de Medici. Between them, they shaped French history for over a century. 3 Medici became popes. The financial instruments they perfected, the bill of exchange, the branch banking system, diversified lending, currency exchange, became the foundations of modern banking. Every time you deposit money in a bank and trust that it will be honored somewhere else, you are using a system the Medici helped build. Every time a company issues shares, or a government sells bonds, or a merchant uses a letter of credit, those instruments trace their lineage, in part, back to a small bank in Florence and a man with a simple but radical idea. The buildings they commissioned still stand. Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Medici commissioned. Michelangelo's early education, Medici funded. The Laurentian Library in Florence, still open to visitors, Medici. They did not just build a bank. They built the world that made the Renaissance possible. And the Renaissance, that explosion of art, science, and human curiosity, changed how Western civilization thought about itself. All of it, somehow, connected back to the movement of money between cities. Historians have studied the Medici for centuries. We have their ledgers. We have their letters. We have the accounts of people who knew them. And still, one question does not have a clean answer. How did they get people to trust them? Not just at the start. The start is understandable. Giovanni was careful, competent, well-connected. But trust at the scale they achieved, across borders, across languages, across different legal systems, that is something else. A letter of credit only works if the person receiving it believes completely that the bank behind it will honor it. In a world with no telephone, no telegraph, no way to verify anything quickly, the Medici convinced merchants from Scotland to Constantinople that their paper was as good as gold. That is a human achievement, not a financial one. It required reputation managed across generations. It required a network of relationships so dense and so consistent that the idea of the Medici defaulting was simply unthinkable. And that is the part that modern banks, for all their technology, have never fully replicated. Because trust is not just a system, it is not a product, it cannot be automated. The Medici built it, held it, and then, slowly, let it slip. The bank closed. The family eventually returned to Florence, but as rulers, not bankers. The financial empire was gone. But somewhere in the architecture of how money moves today, in the networks, the branches, the international obligations honored across borders, the ghost of that single room in 1397 is still visible. A family, a desk, a letter of credit, and the audacious belief that a piece of paper, backed by a name, could be worth its weight in gold. It was, and we are still living in the world that proved it. The Medici solved the problem of trust between strangers, which raises a question worth sitting with. As money becomes digital, as transactions become instant, as algorithms replace relationship managers, who is building the next network, and what will they leave behind?